Warm greetings to you, honorable guest Dr. Hamish Coates, and to all the viewers who are following the 5th episode of The Voice of the Expert, which is a monthly program organized by the Center of Measurement and Evaluation in Education and Development. This program takes place in a particular context marked by the proliferation of a series of crises in our contemporary life, taking many forms: health, economic, social, political, environmental, etc. And of course, all the repercussions and effects that they induce at all levels. It's also changing and evolving context characterized by rapid global transformations and the emergence of new challenges, such as the knowledge explosion, the technological development, and the digital revolution. All of this requires seeking central and vital place for the expert in any field. The Voice of the Expert program aims to highlight the characteristics, interests, and contributions of experts in various fields. It also aims to find out their expectations and prospective perceptions on different topics in their fields of expertise. Today is the 5th episode of this program, in which I have the honor and pleasure to welcome and interview our dear guest, Dr. Hamish Coates. Thank you, Hamish, for accepting the invitation.
Thank you. Look forward to talking with you.
Okay, I start by quickly introducing our honorable guest, who has a great CV with several activities in teaching, leadership, consulting, research, and innovation. Hamish Coates is a tenured professor at Tsinghua University Institute of Education and director of the Higher Education Research Division. He is principal advisor at West Advisory. He was professor of higher education at the University of Melbourne. He is the founding director of higher education research at the Australian Council for Educational Research, and he is the program director at the L.H. Martin Institute for Tertiary Leadership and Management. Through its various activities, he concentrates on improving the quality and productivity of higher education. He is an expert in large-scale evaluation, education policy design, institutional strategy, assessment methodology, learner engagement and success, productivity analysis, engineering, online and hybrid solutions, and academic work and leadership. He has led 100 influential projects. He authored 30 books and monographs, 170 academic papers, and 120 reports. He procured funding for several research projects. He engineered education platforms and policy solutions. Without delay, the first words for you, Dr. Hamish, before we begin to address axes of this episode.
Delighted. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the generous introduction, and delighted to contribute. And clearly, I can shed some light on my own activities and contributions to the field of education research and evaluation. But from my perspective, the most interesting stories have yet to come, because as you pointed out, the world has encountered some dramatic changes in recent years. and our capacity to understand those changes and design education in ways that helps communities and people grow into the future is absolutely dependent upon our understanding of what's going on now and how we design the future. So very happy to talk about contributions in the past, and certainly towards the end of our conversation, look forward to talking about how we can use these techniques and capabilities to make education better for the world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again. The interview will be articulated around 4 axes. The first one is professional and consulting activities. The second, research interests and contributions. The third, nature of part of the expert's part. And finally, future perspectives. So we began with the first axis, professional experience and consulting activities. The first question, Hamish, a question to compare working environments in different countries. We know that you have a variety of experiences in several countries, more than 50 countries. Please compare working environments in these countries. For example, in terms of teaching, research, innovation, if there are similarities and differences in research and innovation, if in several aspects in this area, such as policies and researches, characteristics of learners, researchers, working methods, programs, and curricula, collaboration, etc.
Yes, thank you. Look, it is part of the way I like to contribute to education by working with people from many different backgrounds and in often many different countries. I will say a little bit about my experiences and, as you point out, how the different cultures and countries can play into the sort of work we do in education. Look, fundamentally, I'm a psychometrician, statistician, and policy researcher by background. So I tend to look at the environments in which education happens, but do so in a way that thinks about the flows of information or data that helps education happen. Some of that data happens through policy discourse. Some of it happens through students' testing or assessment. Some of it happens through teachers talking to students. It's all different levels or types of information or dialogue that make education happen. But basically, I begin by understanding that the rudiments of education are the same all around the world, regardless of field, level, history, culture. And ultimately, as Tsinghua's provost said at the start of the pandemic, education is very much about a teacher and a student talking about knowledge. If we start with that very simple foundation, whether we're talking about someone working in early childhood education or someone doing advanced study as part of a PhD, we have the broad building blocks of education, which from a institutional, structural, policy, technical perspective, in terms of computer platforms, anything, are reasonably stable across the world. You know, we invite students into conversations about learning. We give them curriculum, teaching, support. We assess their learning. And then based on that, we do more. And eventually they exit some formal education process and go into another. So with that sort of enduring, or if you like, global outlook on higher education or school education or early childhood education, it's quite possible to take the common themes around the world and not let the contingencies of particular political situations or cultural situations or linguistic situations get in the way of trying to make some kind of improvement. So that's my sort of, if you like, quite structural approach to thinking about education problems. Once we take that approach, we can then use that, if you like, as a framework for diagnosing what's happening in a particular situation and ultimately where we can recommend options for improvement or reform. Now, how you undertake that sort of analysis and the sort of suggestions you make very much does depend on the location, the environment in which you operate. Tsinghua University, for example, is one of the most elite universities in the world. People strive from the age of 1 to go there. Once they get there, they're highly engaged. It's a highly competitive and dynamic environment, academically, socially, professionally. So that sort of context is very different to, if you like, 99% of the other universities and higher education institutions in the world, which are playing a role within their community, but aren't necessarily operating at such competitive extremes. So those sorts of cultures do make a difference. The history that has taken that particular university to where it is now in terms of ancient Chinese philosophy, early foundation years, 111 or 12 years ago, now reforms during periods where it associated and aligned itself with a Russian model of universities, and then over the last 40 years, a US model, increasingly a distinctive Chinese model. You can't ignore those sorts of contexts when looking at the basic foundations of education that I said before, but by understanding them, you can always spot some way that essentially we can help learners do better in terms of their success. The experience around the world, I suppose, has been one of trying to look beyond the contingencies of particular people's or countries' situations and trying to find commonalities. Most of my work is in the field of higher education, and it's incredibly global, which means that students and faculty members and curriculum, money, publications, researchers are flowing all around the world, and the pandemic has only accelerated that, because now we don't have to get on an aeroplane and fly to another country. We can talk quickly with people from many different countries online. So in a way, we have to be sensitive to the context, but in another way, there are layers of engagement and collaboration that go well beyond those. I think in the distinctive area of higher education, it's going to be interesting to see how long we can keep doing research without having major international conferences and bilateral or multilateral forms of research, because ultimately education is about, like I said, getting people together. But it's something that I think we can't ignore, whether you engage globally within an institution or whether you engage globally as a teacher teaching students from diverse backgrounds, or whether you engage with global research partners or as institutions working together. That's part of the future of the way higher education tends to happen. So my experience, not just working with policy and evaluation pieces of work, but also we have an ongoing piece of work around assessing the way university presidents and leaders run and design their universities. Suggests that there are common thoughts and common mindsets around the world, and generally speaking, it's possible to find convergence and shared views amongst those. So yes, culture and history and context matters, but actually it's the interests of people who work in common fields that have the breakthrough potential in terms of higher education. I don't think there's anywhere in the world that doesn't want to continue to improve the education of people. So it's a common standard across the world, and how we go about that, I guess, is a shared objective. So it's good to be part of the conversation.
Okay, Hamish, question 2. You have a variety of professional experiences in terms of teaching, assessing students, supervising and advising students, what you consider your proper best practices?
So in line with my own field of research around student success and learning outcomes and policies that help deliver productive reforms to education institutions and systems, I very much start with my students who are always graduate students in their 20s or working professionals, much like ourselves, by saying, where do you want to be at the end of this education conversation, which may be part of a formal program, may be part of a doctoral degree, may be part of a master's degree, may be part of some executive education. Because at the end of it, what we want to do is make sure that people have made some progress. Sometimes they don't know what the progress is going to look like or where they will go, but they have some sense that they want to be different at the end of an education experience than they are at the start, what we technically call value added. Now, how you do that depends on who you're talking to. Of course, if there's 1,000 people in the room or 100 students, you have to take a different approach than if you're dealing in a very intense way with doctoral supervision that spans many years. But finding out where people want to be, what they see as success for themselves, is a really important way of starting the educational process. You know, I think it's a really huge limitation that so much education starts with a fixed notion of a curriculum and a teacher delivering that curriculum to students without recourse to first understanding where the students want to be. And of course, the next step is to finding out where the students are now. And it's really my job, I see, to take the student or the learner, and it could be a university executive, from where they are now to where they seek to go. And in some instances, of course, that does work. In some instances, it doesn't work. And it's the process of learning, which itself has risks of failure embedded within it, which is such an interesting thing to be part of. I have rarely seen people come up with a vision of where they want to be at the end of an education process. I'm talking mostly about graduate students in top global universities who don't succeed against those targets, if you like. For example, I may ask a student, you know, where are you now coming into a PhD program, and what sort of job, what sort of lifestyle, what sort of colleagues, where do you want to live at the end? And I say, try and make it very concrete, because it's one thing to say, I want to have a happy life and a good job, but try and make that real in terms of how you think about where you want to be. And once they write that down and spend the next 3 or 4 years doing graduate coursework, research study, and look back on what they wrote 3 or 4 years ago, it's almost always the case that they underestimated their accomplishments. And that's a real positive thing to come out of education. The sad thing is, we don't normally ask students to do that. When students come into studying with us in most institutions of education around the world, we basically say, this is what you will learn, this is what we're going to teach you, and you're going to sit down, shut up and learn for 10, 12 weeks. Not the most efficient way of helping people learn, and it plays a role in schools, certainly, which have other social functions, in initial university and training degrees. But once we start to look at advanced research or professional education, we need to take a much smarter approach. And increasingly, that's an area of work that I'm becoming fascinated by, doing work with colleagues, particularly around Asia, East Asia, around future skills, lifelong learning, and how we can understand how to take formal education infrastructure and capability and give it to those people. Because it's just not enough anymore to say someone leaves school at 17, 18, does some things in university or in a vocational institution, and by the age of 22 then works to the age of 65 or 70. There's a constant process of upskilling, reskilling and augmenting yourself that needs to happen. Yet as educators, we just don't have the slightest idea almost how to systematize that across the world. That's the new frontier for education evaluation and design. But whether it's at that level of national policy setting or working individually with students, it's got to start by saying, what sort of things do you want to succeed? And where are you now? And how can we help you make the difference?
Mm-hmm. Okay, Amish, my question 3 concerns consulting. In terms of professional appointments, you carried different consultations. Please describe briefly the tasks carried out from your main experiences in consulting.
Yeah, so look, I mean, I'm a sort of consultant researcher, so I see education as a very applied thing. I mean, it has a lot of theory, has a lot of very complex techniques and computer platforms, but ultimately, as I've just said, we want to help people learn. So if it's theory without some application to practice at some point, that's not for me. So trying to see large problems with policy, with institutions, with students, with education programs, with teaching, with computer technologies, with the way that big universities are doing deals with big software firms, trying to spot those big areas of problem. And often at the frontier is the first part of being a decent consultant. You know, there are many consultants that solve structural or operational problems. I'm not one of those people. So a lot of my work has involved designing systems or institutional structures, data collections, new terminologies, if you like, that governments or institutions or educators can use. And then, of course, finding some way of developing change to give some substance to those ideas. So I'll give you a few examples. In my own PhD work, I studied how students at university use online platforms to engage with their university studies. So I looked at higher education policy and practice, student engagement, and online platforms. This was 20 years ago. And now we find that everyone in the world is studying this. So the concepts and the instruments and the data collections which I developed then, which luckily I was able to take to scale in Australia and New Zealand and about 30 different countries in close partnership with colleagues in the United States, have now been embedded in many countries in terms of how we understand students' engagement in online higher education. And when I say embedded, I mean, you know, students and teachers fill out questionnaires and develop all sorts of data collections to report to government. Certainly in my home country of Australia, there's now mandatory reports to government on just those topics. So that, in fact, we're not just doing what was the norm when I started in this field 20 years ago of surveying students about their satisfaction with service provision. We're instead asking people, are they doing the things which are going to generate high quality learning outcomes for graduates and help them succeed as people? That's one example. I mean, reform on assessment is another area. It's really, really important that we have confidence in the quality of people's learning reports. And if the learning reports are underpinned by bad quality assessment or inefficient or expensive assessment, then the community, the employers, the students, the graduates, the parents, they won't trust it. So trying to develop more robust, rigorous and efficient assessments has been a huge part of my research and professional career for the last 20 years through consultations with OECD, several countries, several institutions around the world, and increasingly over the last 3 or 4 years with several software providers, because software platforms are the way that we can take not just cheap practice, but good practice to scale. But, you know, the solution there isn't tech. The solution is educators designing ways of assessing student learning that are actually efficient, cogent, robust, and also meaningful in the situation in which they're learning and going to practice their careers. So there are two areas, if you like, focused on learning and student engagement assessment, where consultations with a whole range of clients, and in some instances developing workforces, both people to do jobs in institutions, but also, for example, when we developed the OECD assessment of student learning outcomes in higher education, there were very few countries that had people who knew about assessment, knew about areas of practice such as engineering or economics, and knew about higher education. Most assessment specialists, for example, were specialists in the K-12 sector. And people that worked in engineering did assessment in their particular way, not in terms of measurement science, and may not have been deeply engaged in higher education policy considerations. So, over the last 13, 14 years, there's actually been a group of us around the world who have tried to educate people in that obvious growth area, where some of the most advanced countries in the world simply didn't have any workforce a dozen years ago. So yeah, look, consultation has been a huge part of my job because it's how we make a difference at various levels of education.
Okay, Hamish, another position. You are principal advisor at Wealth Advisory. What are your main contributions in this position? With a brief manner, please.
Yeah. So I in terms of Wealth Advisory, it's a boutique advisory firm in the field of higher education, principally based in Melbourne, Australia, and with offices in London, who give advice to higher education systems and institutions and leaders, and very much in terms of operating, as I just said, at those frontier areas and trying to think, where is the future of higher education regulation? Where is the future of how we design education institutions that are offering learning on a global scale, offering teaching services on a global scale? And those sorts of discussions feed into those sorts of projects that they can then help to give advice to governments and university leaders.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and finally, the question 5, you were the founding director of higher education research at the Australian Council for Educational Research. What are the tasks carried out during your works?
Yeah, so ACR is a tremendously successful non-profit education research organisation based in Melbourne, Australia, but has grown internationally and does a lot of work in Asia, Middle East, Europe and beyond. When I was there, it was running OECD PISA, started by one of the research directors at ACR. And there was an enormous amount of talent there, running lots of national assessments and doing a lot of work in higher education, but not in a focused, structured, market-centric sort of way. So my job was to, if you like, get the capability of that organisation and make that relevant to higher education, help higher education institutions at the same time. And by that I mean leaders and government specialists, policymakers, understand the capability of ACR and start to generate a new suite of projects, and the development of national data collections for higher education emerged from several suites of projects that we did during that time, and other admissions work and understanding of student learning outcomes and the like, through to diagnostic instruments for university leaders, for example. So using the technical and other capabilities and know-how of that institution, developing a workforce and suite of researchers, many of whom are still there, and also helping those people and higher education institutions around the world engage with that institution. So genuinely being a bit of an entrepreneur, I suppose, and carving out a new resource for higher education. most consulting firms in that area very much were focused on admissions testing. ETS in the US is a classic example, running GRE and SAT and a range of other TOEFL and the like. And to take it beyond the admissions and say, well, actually, we can look at the assessment and evaluation of learning throughout the institutional process, beyond graduation, was a really big part of the development there, and which continues apace.
Mm-hmm. Okay, before to move the second axis, if you have anything to add on this first axis.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear on the first.
If you have anything to add on this first axis.
No, I think that's okay. We can keep moving. Yeah.
So now we move to the second axis, research interests and achievements, or main contributions. You have studied and researched many issues concerning higher education, among which there are large-scale evaluation, education policy design, institutional strategy, assessment methodology, learner engagement, productivity analysis, and academic work and leadership. We will discuss each of these areas in depth to know the topics studied and the main contributions you have done. So essentially, for any topic, for any area, we search to know the main topic and the main topics and the main contributions. My first question concerns the topic assessment student learning outcomes in higher education. What are the research questions studied and what are the main results that you found?
So the research questions there are sort of how we define learning and how we measure learning. And because of my background as a psychometrician, I bring to that the perspective of a measurement scientist. You know, there is a whole field of researchers in higher education who study higher education assessment in all sorts of ways. The nature of feedback, the various merits of using multiple choice questions versus essays. I mean, I take a much broader view in terms of how we can advance the technical fundamentals of that work, and over the last 5 years, in particular, how computer platforms can be used to take that to scale. So the signature projects there for me are being the International Project Director of the OECD, a HELLO project, Assessment of Higher Education Learning Outcomes project, and various other projects, some confidential, some for government, running a student admissions test based on student aptitude for the Australian government, rather than relying on school achievement scores, running outcomes assessments to look at students' generic skills for institutions in different countries. And those research projects almost always seek to come up with a more efficient, robust, and valuable way for understanding what people have learned. Right now, we're working on a brand new view of learning where we actually put assessment at the start. So we start the learning process with an assessment, diagnostic, if you like, and try and say, well, in the field of English or in the field of accounting or the field of medicine or science, these are the things the learner brings, and these are the things the learner needs to learn about. And then offering training or education opportunities accordingly. Of course, education's always done that, but not really at scale and not really efficiently. So that's very much the future of how we do education in terms of assessment not being a thing that happens at the end, but a thing that happens very much at the start and on the way through. In fact, there are many views in theory that assessment should be as much as possible invisible, and there is ongoing forms of assessment. So that's an exciting frontier, and one that technology is really starting to enable us to unleash.
Amish, another question. We know that there are many surveys in scholar education to assess student achievements. For example, PISA, TEAMS, PIRS, in school education, but in higher education, with regard to the large-scale assessment of achievements at national or international level, are there efforts to carry out surveys on this subject? Efforts other than the ILO study that you have participated to it?
Look, there's an ongoing series of dialogues around the world to try and generate, if you like, an international assessment of student learning. And the real push there is basically from people who work in governments with experience of having succeeded on that front in the school sector with the sorts of studies that you mentioned, but also people in government and also business and higher education who are genuinely dissatisfied with the quality of university education being represented globally by research publications and other research outputs. The need to put some cogent measure of learning on the table has only grown since the OECD ministers meeting in 2006, when it was first suggested that the world needed a measure of learning that went beyond the institution. How that happens is the really tricky question. There was an effort to do it via governments, which I led. About 25 governments participated in that, about 250 universities. There have been several commercial activities through publishing firms, through the like. There have been various professional activities through professional accreditation or individual licensing exams. There are some national initiatives. In the US, some widely used assessments used as part of university accreditation processes, which have been spread internationally to a certain extent. I think the observation that those of us who monitor the field has probably come out with is that it's just far too complicated for one assessment, in the same way that you might have a PISA assessment in schools. And the reason for that is the diversity of universities, but invariably there will be some shared points of data around student learning. My view is they won't come from a standalone student test, because that's something that we had back in the 1920s and before. And if you look at how PISA has evolved, it has evolved in highly complex ways that fully leverage the contemporary computing and online systems that we now have at our fingertips. So how we assess student learning in ways that are going to be generalizable at a global level will very much come through the use of advanced computer platforms, I think. And of course, almost every university now is using video conferencing facilities and learning management facilities, and often very similar sorts of curriculum resources to teach their students. So one might imagine that just finding some way of linking those up is actually perhaps the most promising way forward, not through running an independent student test. That may happen, but in some countries, very difficult, because the universities have very loose relationship with government. And even in some countries where governments can tell universities what to do, the universities think it's not a good idea. So, just looking at the education practice that's underway seems to me to be a very promising way forward. The Xuetangx platform at Tsinghua University, for example, now I believe the world's biggest MOOC, or online curriculum platform. When we were first having a conversation along these lines about 4 years ago, it had about 100,000 assessment items in it. So certainly the last thing we need to do is to build more assessment tasks. What we do need to do is somehow find a way of aligning and quality assuring those tasks and making them generalisable across institutions. And for about 4 years in Australia and New Zealand, in partnership with some other countries in Asia and Europe, we developed and run what we referred to as the Australian Medical Assessment Collaboration, where we in fact did that with all of the medical schools. They had their existing assessment tasks used for preclinical assessment of doctors, before they go into the hospitals, and we got them and quality assured them and came up with some collaborative assessments, and that very much is the future, I think, the collaborative assessment. In fact, we just published some books on that in recent years, its application.
Okay, another topic concerns, which is important, very important, concerns productivity in higher education. For this topic, what are the research questions studied and what are the main results that you found?
Yeah, so higher education suffers from what many refer to as the cost disease. In a similar way to a symphony orchestra, we still need the same basic equipment, but it's much more expensive today than it was 100 years ago. So who pays for that is a really big question, and that problem of who pays is solved in different ways around the world. In the US, a lot of household debt from students. In China, government largely pays. Students make a modest contribution. In Australia, students and government pay, but the student pays through an income-deferred tax scheme as they earn as graduates. Very successful approach, though not without its limitations. So the issue about higher education finance is always there and has its own solutions, but fundamentally, we also need to address the issue of how higher education is designed and administered. And for everyone who has studied productivity, we know that it's outcomes divided by input, and it's incredibly important. So not just focusing on the input of money, but also looking at the outcomes and how we can find different ways of re-engineering the way of generating those outcomes is hugely important. So that's one aspect of studying productivity, if you like, institutional reform. Another aspect is just to generate insights into what universities are contributing that has some relationship to the size and nature of the institution. So university ranks are quite misleading because they don't take into account, or many do not, the inputs that go in. You cannot compare Harvard University with all of its budget with the University of Melbourne, my alma mater, which probably has a budget of about a third, if not a quarter of the size. Somehow you need to do a division there and then make the comparison between staff numbers, research output, student numbers and the like. In fact, Harvard has, I suspect, many fewer students because it can afford to, as the funding model for the University of Melbourne is that prices are capped because of the loan scheme and political reasons in that country, and therefore there are many students. So the faculty can't do as much research because they're servicing the student. So look, there's a institutional reform side to that conversation, but there's also very much, back to my main interest, a metric side to the conversation. From about 2012, in collaboration with the guru of the field, Professor Bill Massey in the US, and a project that emanated out of the National Academy of Science in Washington, DC, I took to the Asian Productivity Organization the idea of running a multi-country study in this area, and we did, with about 6 or 7 countries, run the common algorithm, various outputs divided by inputs across some countries in Asia, and make comparisons at the institutional and national level. And in fact, we have continued that work looking at elite universities around the world who say that they are competing against each other. So we looked at their performance and then divided it by the sorts of inputs that were going into them, and quite clear trends come out in terms of the boundaries of what institutions in different systems can achieve. And in fact, there's an exciting book about to be released in the next couple of months where we have taken that logic to even more university systems. It's a topic that preoccupies every government and every university leader around the world, both in terms of how you understand or measure outcomes divided by inputs, productivity, but also then how you can re-engineer the institution to try and do that. And there's obviously several ways of doing that, several strategies and tactics, and that's the sort of thing that you can empirically see once you try to formalize your work in this area.
Okay, Hamish, another topic, engagement of higher education students. Same question, what are the research questions and what are the main contributions that you found?
Mm-hmm. The major research question around student engagement is to find out whether institutions of education and students enacting in ways or behaving in ways, and whether there's supports and conditions and infrastructure in place that is likely to generate high quality student outcomes. So given the difficulty of measuring student outcomes in a generalisable way, we can realistically say if students and teachers and institutions are doing these things, we're more likely to have student success. I got engaged in this area about 20 so years ago doing my PhD and developed an instrument for use in Australia, both for universities on campus and also study online. And then at my work, the Australian Council for Education Research took that to a national and international scale. So we've now run the survey, published 2 books. We've just released another book on global student engagement, which is being launched at a conference in Ireland in 2 days' time, where we have looked at how these collections now in probably 30 or 40 countries can provide unparalleled or perhaps even as well unprecedented insight into education quality. There has now been national surveys developed, which I also developed within Australia, that are used to regulate every higher education institution in the country, such that student engagement is now considered to be a metric that matters existentially for every institution in Australia, but also increasingly now something that's embedded in the conversations around the world in terms of staff roles, institutional aspirations, marketing, staff recruitment, promotion, development, advice to students. And increasingly, we see a global network of professionals who work in that field. And our books have tried to pick up on that. You know, there's an emerging side to this that's also quite interesting, which is at the frontiers now, but will become front and centre. It's not just about how students engage in university, but about how students engage with universities that themselves are engaging. And here we see the whole conversation open up about sustainability and SDGs and the engagement of education sectors broadly with the community, which is an area where universities around the world are starting to be pushed. So previously, my first project in education was to say, how do we evaluate not the quality of teaching and learning, but students' engagement in the campus? And then we start to look at students' engagement with specific communities. But increasingly, we're going to say, what's the student and the university's engagement with the world? And that's what we might refer to as maybe education engagement, not student engagement. We've made some contributions in that area, looking at social contribution, social impact, and the like, but really higher education is now just starting to go down that path. We've just finished a paper. We've looked at university presidents' engagement with the UN SDGs, and it's very early days, but that will be a direction of travel in years to come.
Okay, another topic which had a rapid acceleration during COVID-19, the digitalization of higher education. What are the research questions studied and what are the main results that you found?
Yeah, so my first experience in terms of computer platforms in education was dropping out of computer science back in the early 90s because I couldn't get credit transfer between the University of Melbourne and Queen's University in Canada. Some insight into the Neanderthal way in which universities around the world engage in credit transfer arrangements, which is an ongoing problem. But also insight that sometimes dropping out of something doesn't mean you leave it alone or you've learnt nothing. Because in fact, I have spent the last 20, 25 years developing a whole host of platforms, and that continues, largely around student assessment, student engagement platforms for collecting data, platforms that enable education institutions to collect data. Many education institutions don't have the capacity to collect data. And in the last few years, we see Qualtrics and Google Forms come up, but in fact, 10 years ago, those didn't exist. So how we help people to collect and understand and report information has been the frontiers in which I've tried to develop new resources. You know, we still lack in the world a place where someone can go and find out where is the best place that they should study. If I was asked by a friend, where should I send my child to university, I don't think I could give a decent answer to that question, even being a professor of higher education, because the sources of information that I have available are not necessarily the most reliable or consistent or readily available to the general public. And we still need to have a way of giving good advice to people who don't know anything about higher education. It was a conference organised by the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario in Canada 5 years ago, where I realised that the people who invest the most in higher education know the least about it. It is, as Dirk van Dam, colleague who used to work at the OECD, said, one of the riskiest and weirdest investments most people make. They simply invest based on the thinking that it will bring them a better life through career, through social connections, through knowledge and skills. But we actually have very little evidence for that. I mean, I think we feel it who work inside education, but we haven't done a terribly good job of not just bragging about our success, but sharing with people who don't have the skills to understand what we do, insights that can help engage them in our brilliant field of work. So, look, that's the emerging area. I wouldn't say reporting; I'd say engagement softwares, and that's what we're trying to do now.
Okay, the last question for this second axis concerns the innovation side. You have engineered educational platforms and policy solutions. What are the objectives and functionalities of these solutions, and what is the level of their use in higher education sphere, and who are their effects? So 3 questions in one last question of this second axis.
Look, it's a complex question. I'll give you one example. About 2006, a colleague in Australia asked me what data or ideas we had that could be used to define academic standards in higher education. And so I went onto the internet and looked in the library, researched databases and talked with some people and realised that while everyone used the word academic standards, in fact, very little was written. So I did a piece of work with some universities in Australia, wrote some papers that were published in the now defunct OECD journal, took that thinking into the assessment of student learning outcomes that I mentioned before, but most particularly came up with the idea that if we were going to talk about academic standards and have some quality assurance or policies or funding or risk-based approaches to regulation that took account of academic standards, we needed to put those on firm footing. So developing an idea of academic standards and academic quality indicators was something I spent a lot of time doing in 2005 to 2008. No one was engaging then, but in about 2008, the Australian government did a thorough review of the national systems and suggested that a new approach to quality assurance and higher education regulation should be developed based on the idea of quality indicators and standards. So that work directly fed into a new approach to risk-based, standards-based regulation of higher education. And in fact, is still the way it's done today, using coincidentally from other projects the indicators that I developed around student engagement. So look, that's one example of, if you like, policy innovation. Policy innovation education can take many, many years. So often we see the results of our work after about 10 or so years. I'm sure I haven't answered all 3 parts of your question, but maybe it gives a sense of the sort of intellectual contribution and how that can feed into a policy development and ultimately a national or practical outcome.
Okay, Hamish, if you want to add more about your research interests and your main contributions, now we can move to the third axis.
Yeah, we move, it's fine.
Yes. Now I move to the third axis, the nature of experts' career. How was the academic and professional road of flowers or a road with obstacles and difficulties? So the first question, we start with the positive. We know that the success factors are diverse and quite numerous. Some are intrinsic and others are extrinsic. What are the most important success factors that helped to create your academic or professional path?
Look, I think, as I tell my students, you've got to keep your feet on the ground, your head fighting amongst all the muddle and confusion that the world puts before us in the cloud, but you've got to have your head above the clouds too. But just having the head above the clouds with the feet not on the ground doesn't work, because you have a lot of great ideas, but they don't happen. And if you have your head in the clouds, of course, that's a mess. So look, just keeping a sense that, like I said right at the start, education is about some pretty simple processes, and we have some tools and techniques and data collections which are never perfect, but we can bring them to bear to try and solve some problems or create new ones. But they've got to be relevant to education. So keeping a firm view on, if you're studying early childhood education, but you've never played in a sandpit, then you've forgotten what it's about. You've got to get involved in teaching, and I've always kept up my teaching. You've got to always be talking with students. If you're running an institution, you need to go and see how the janitor is cleaning the bathrooms, because it tells you everything you need to know about how students are valued in the institution. And I must say, the best university presidents that I've interviewed, we put out a book on university president interviews last year, 2 books. And we have a colleagues about to put out another book. The best people keep a sense of that whole chain in which they're operating. But look, other areas which have been really helpful have been having really good mentors along the way. People who give you courage and confidence when sometimes, life is tough. And, just being a little bit resilient and getting moving when things are often slow. It's particularly hard at the start of your career because things are slow and you don't have momentum. So it's good to have many different interests, and some of them will take off sooner than others.
Okay, now
luck.
Okay, now if in a negative in your career, are there any difficulties, problems, obstacles that have negatively affected your academic or professional path?
Oh, one encounters problems every day, and sometimes you encounter big problems. Part of the skill of being a researcher is being able to somehow do a risk assessment and understand the problems that you're going to face in a project, of course, but as you say, in a career, and as you develop a career, if you do research and research that you hope will make a difference, you're going to encounter all sorts of problems. People that don't like change is very common. People who don't like people coming up with ideas that might be threatening to the way that institutions or systems currently run. So, look, you're always encountering issues, people that don't see the value in what you're doing because it has a payoff 10 years down the track. That's part of life. Of course, as you're younger, it can be very depressing experience, but the skill there is to put in place supports and guides around you to help you understand that, even if you encounter a problem today, tomorrow you can do something new or different or address the issue and keep moving. Nothing that is valuable is simple. So it's a matter of pushing forward and keeping things moving. Yeah, as I tell my students, many of whom now are in lockdown, which is tough for young people. You know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So in 50 years' time, you look back on this experience and say, you know, I spent 1-2 months in my room, you know, and I wrote my first book. Yeah.
Okay, the last question for this third axis. Are there any personal failures or mistakes in your academic or professional path? Any mistakes or failures?
Research is a constant mistake. As Pat Terrancini, my advisor, who examined my thesis from Penn State, one of the big people in the field in the US, said, research is one compromise after the other. You know, and as I've said to all of my students, particularly in China, many of whom have never made a mistake academically, and that's why they've got to the top. It's so competitive. If you don't fail, you can't succeed. And that's particularly the case with cutting edge research. So, yeah, I mean, we're constantly making mistakes. I have failed to get intellectual property ownership over some huge developments, which I've donated, if you like, to very rich organisations and governments. I have failed to position ideas right that enables them to take off. I have failed to do certain research projects which would have been much more contributing in hindsight than if I had invested in other areas. But, you know, we stumble from one stepping stone to the next and hope that we make a difference.
Now we move to the third axis, perceptions and projections towards the future. I ask you, Hamish, to give brief answers. The first one, what are the contributions that you consider the most important of your academic career and your various consultations? Which
definitely.
Yes.
Yes, definitely working with colleagues and students to help them build their career, because those are the people that you do things with. Yeah, so sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, just working with people to make things happen. That's the best contribution. That's where you really see value in what you do during your day job, and also the sorts of people that you keep in contact with all around the world. Sometimes that happens interpersonally, but often it happens through publishing things or developing things, and people find out who you are. And I still get people emailing me about papers that I wrote 20 years ago. So there's the social side of research, and particularly when it's made a difference to the world.
Okay, question 2. Do you have any open question or problem that has not yet been addressed in the field of higher education or otherwise? Open question.
Look, the really serious question that we face is we're facing a turnover in expertise in my field. A lot of the colleagues that I've had from Europe and America in particular, who were my age when I started in the field, are now 60 to 85, sometimes 90 years of age. So where is the next generation of not just scholars, but innovators and if you like, innovative thinkers and policymakers? Where are those people? And it's not just about age, but it sort of is. Mm-hmm. If I look now at who will be doing research and development in higher education, evaluation, assessment, productivity reform, transformation, design sort of work, a lot of these people are now working in private sector consultancy firms, tech firms and the like. That's great, but who's doing the broader thinking about the future of education? That's an open question. I think there are people there, but they're not organised in the professional networks, the journals, the international organisations like they were 20 or 30 years ago. So we need to find new organising mechanisms for those knowledge conversations, because otherwise we won't have those knowledge conversations and education won't improve. So to me, that's one of the most important unknowns or frontier issues, if you like. In terms of assessment, evaluation, student development, student learning, admissions practices, we have ongoing challenges and problems. There is no such thing as perfect, but there is always a better way. And that's the challenge and the excitement of research.
Okay, another question. What is the future of higher education systems for tomorrow in terms of quality and productivity?
It's almost certain that we will get more globally recognised approaches to understanding the quality and productivity of higher education. The idea that a teacher in one country is delivering a lecture in several different countries but doesn't have the skills, teaching, intellectual, or maybe even linguistic or cultural skills to understand the country is really weird. Now, that's not something that probably happened at scale until relatively recently, but it is now happening. So you can now see China, for example, saying if you want to deliver education services into the Chinese market, you need to have certain skills, professional competencies. Other countries have their own regulations, of course. Some in terms of what goes on in the background when you're giving a lecture online, but others in terms of how you move your hands or the sort of language you use. So I use those as trivial examples, but they all add up. We are going to need to have global standards in terms of higher education teaching. We've already got them to a certain extent in research in certain fields, but particularly in terms of teaching. And not just in terms of teaching, curriculum, student learning, that's all taking shape. It's now coalescing much more at the admissions side in terms of how people understand who's capable of entering higher education systems, particularly for international students, through the range of a lot of advanced platforms and professional organisations around the world. But we'll see that flow through higher education. Not every institution, but many. And the real promise there is, of course, that you can then have higher education operating in many different places around the world with students and faculty located in different countries around the world. And there are some instances of that where US teachers are teaching into institutions in Asia because of the pandemic. That probably won't go away. And there are students also in some experimental institutions where they do move around the world in different campuses of those universities or institutions. So look, that's the big picture future.
Okay. Obviously, evaluation is an important component of higher education. In your opinion, what will be the future of evaluation? All kids, the evaluation of learning outcomes, the evaluation of programs, the evaluation of institutions, the evaluation of research, and the evaluation of the globally of higher education systems.
Abdul Ali, I probably have to leave in about 5 to 10 minutes, just given the time. So what we're going to see is very much not an evaluation of inputs and capabilities or evaluation of process, which is largely where I've spent most of my career so far, but we are now shifting to focus very much on contribution, impact, influence. If your research doesn't have influence, if your students don't succeed, if your students can't get a job, if your teaching doesn't inspire people, if you don't engage communities and build up communities through economic development, social development, they're the sorts of things that we're going to see education being focused on, not so much learning per se, but does that learning actually contribute to a broader outcome? We don't have the data to do that evaluation now. If you look at the SDGs and map them across higher education institutions, we just don't have shared data, often even data, to answer some of those questions. Answering the question about the impact of scholarly and applied research is really, really difficult. We see exercises in the UK and various other countries to try and do that, but they're very expensive. They're not yet at the scale at which we could roll them out across the world.
Okay, Hamish, you know that the context today is very particular, characterized mainly by the knowledge explosion and the digital revolution. All this will expand and will develop in the future. What will be the future of teaching and learning?
Well, that depends on who's learning and who's teaching. In one end, you could say, right, basic accounting could be taught by one robot who can then speak many different languages. Pretty boring, but it's probably already happening. In fact, that's a large way in which I started to learn Chinese languages using an app on my phone that was pretty much a fake person speaking Chinese at me. You know, that's going to happen. But also we're going to see much more differentiation in terms of the sorts of teaching and learning that happens. You know, elite institutions in some fields, institutions serving their local communities in others. I ask my students at Tsinghua University who I teach, what does the university look like that you will lead in 20 to 30 years? And the things they draw look nothing like what we have today. So from my perspective, the short answer to your question is the future is exciting.
Okay, Hamish, the last question. What are your ambitions and your future plans?
Well, just keep on contributing to education. It's sometimes frustrating sector. It doesn't move as fast as the stock exchange or international trade or politics. But, you know, over a period of years, you do see things building up, which you can point to and say, if I hadn't have had that thought or done that project or worked with those people or travelled to that meeting, I wouldn't have been able to have that contribution and that thing wouldn't exist. And to me, that's an incredibly fulfilling sort of career. Now, whether that happens as a university faculty member, as I have been for the last 10 years, as consultant, as I was before that, you know, or in some kind of other role, that's yet to be seen. I mean, one of the beauties of education is it's such a diverse field. Different countries have come up, others have plateaued, institutions change and roles change themselves. So, you know, in our study of leadership, we see now the people running universities do a job that simply didn't exist when they were PhD students. So not for me to sort of forecast the future in tangible terms, but certainly contributing to education is an exciting part of that. Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to talk, and I look forward to not just you know, engaging in more of these sorts of conversations, but indeed to looking at the suite of conversations and voices, if you like, that you're compiling. I think it's a very important initiative and something that will be very useful, particularly to the young people in our field who are learning about what we do. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We are now coming to end of the episode 5 of the Voice of the Expert program, in which we had the honor of inviting our dear colleague, Dr. Hamish Kautz. Thank you, Hamish, for having responded favorably to the invitation and for having nourished the discussion by bringing rich and valued information from your academic career, which will, of course, be shared with the members of the scientific community. Goodbye and see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Very much. Bye-bye.